Chapter 5. Elizabeth was standing in the middle of her bedchamber, wringing her hands and worrying her lower lip, when her maid entered the room. "What has happened, my lady?" Pansy cried as she saw her mistress appearing to be in distress. "Have you found someone to teach me self-defence?" she asked by way of an answer. Pansy stopped abruptly in front of her mistress, taking one of her cold hands into her own work-worn ones. "Yes, my lady. One of the footmen, Stanley, is knowledgeable in such matters, and strikes me as being a trustworthy sort, if you're wanting to keep matter quiet." "That would probably be for the best. While I am terrified and want to be as prepared as possible, the entire purpose of this arrangement is to avoid a scandal. If it became known that I was learning to defend myself, it would stir up far worse gossip than anything else that has gone before it, I am sure. How soon do you think we could start?" Elizabeth could feel her maid's worried scrutiny. "We are at your disposal whenever you wish, my lady. Surely you realize that. But why the urgency?" "My mother has decided that I ought to be married within the week. That gives me very little time." "Oh!" Pansy's widened eyes were full of excitement, but Elizabeth could tell she was trying to keep it under wraps. Elizabeth rolled her eyes at the maid's tone in the one-word answer. She was well aware that, for the maid, it would be a huge advancement in her status to go from being the personal maid of an earl's youngest daughter to the lady's maid of a countess. But she was loyal enough to feel trepidation on her mistress's behalf. The other girl was still holding her hands, so Elizabeth squeezed them gently before releasing her. She paced across the room, no longer able to stand still. "Under the circumstances, I doubt if my mother will require my presence this afternoon, until it is time to prepare for our social engagements for the evening. If you would be so kind as to arrange for Stanley to meet us here, I would like to begin as soon as possible." She paused in thought, glancing down at her fashionable attire. "Well, perhaps it would be best if it were in half an hour. I really ought to put on my oldest clothes. I would hate to have to explain the loss of one of my newest gowns. I'm quite certain this is going to be a physically demanding exercise." "Very well, my lady. I will run down to have a word with him and be back momentarily to help you change." Elizabeth was left alone with her thoughts. Her stomach tied itself into knots as she thought of all that had transpired. Was it possible that just last week she had been blissfully unaware, thinking she could wait out her mother's ambitions and set herself up independently upon her 21st birthday, if she didn't manage to find someone to love in the meantime? In the past week, her best friend had been abducted, she had been compromised, and now was engaged to marry a man who was thought to have killed his first wife. "It is enough to give one a fit of the vapours," she thought, as she gazed searchingly at her own reflection in the mirror over her dressing-table. Seeing the harried expression on her face, she stuck her tongue out at her own image before turning her back to the mirror. She would not give in to such weakness. She was a resourceful young woman. She would find a way to work with the wretched circumstances being thrown her way. She was relieved when Pansy returned. Action was much better than her own worries. Together they made short work of getting her changed, and within a few minutes the footman presented himself, and they were ready to get to work. The footman was a sturdy young man who looked decidedly uncomfortable to be in the bedchamber of his master's daughter. Elizabeth tried to set him at ease. "Thank you so much for agreeing to do this for me, Stanley. I appreciate your promise to keep this a secret. You do understand that I am about to be married, and am feeling nervous about moving to an estate where I know no one. At all of our properties I have known everyone since my birth. I have no worries there. But when I move to Heath, I shan't know who to trust. Pansy and I thought it best if I learn how to look after myself a little bit." "But surely his lordship will see to your safety, my lady," the footman tried to protest. "I am certain he shall do his best," Elizabeth agreed. "But I would so much rather have a little bit of preparation, just in case." Stanley must have accepted the wisdom of her logic as he gave up any protests and launched into an explanation. "For this to work, my lady, it would be best if you could take your assailant by surprise. And you had best be prepared to run like a rabbit, because I can assure you that he'll be mighty angry with you as soon as he is able to move." Elizabeth gazed at the young man in bewilderment until he furthered his explanation. "I'm going to teach you how you can down a man by hitting him in his jewels." This did not clear the matter up for Elizabeth, but Pansy was quick to explain. "You'll be hitting him in his private parts, my lady." Elizabeth could feel her blush scorch her face. That surely would be beyond the pale. If you'll be needing these instructions, m'lady, the last thing you'll be worrying about is being beyond the pale. Pansy's words were sensible and bolstered Elizabeth's determination, and reinforced her fears. Very well, Stanley, let us proceed. All right, m'lady. If a man comes at you from the front, you'll want to grab his shoulders to give you as much leverage as possible. Then you'll push up with your knee as hard as you can, doing your level best to aim at his private area. If you make a direct hit, he should be down for quite some time. But even if you just wing him, he'll have to bend over with his pains. Then, when he bends over, you'll bring your knee up again as hard as you can and knock him in the head. Then you'll push him over and run like the very devil is after you, because I promise you, he will be if you wait around any. Elizabeth could feel that her eyes were probably as wide as saucers, but she nodded her understanding while the footman positioned himself in front of her. Now, m'lady, I would appreciate it something fierce if you would try not to actually hit me, but you ought to practice the motions at least, so that you can feel how high you would have to bring your knee and how much your skirts might get in the way. The poor young man's face appeared to be on fire, and Elizabeth had to stifle a nervous giggle despite the seriousness of the situation. She truly appreciated his tutorial. They went through the motions several times. He had been quite correct that it would take a great deal of effort to be effective, but she knew that if she was terrorized, she would be quite motivated. The exertions were causing her to sheen with sweat, but she was beginning to feel quite empowered, as though she were regaining a level of control over her life that had been lost the night before in that small room at Lady Oliver's. She grinned at the two servants before her. Very well, m'lady. I quite think you have mastered that as well as you can. Now, you ought to be prepared for an attack from behind. Elizabeth could feel a little of the blood drain from her head, and her feeling of triumph fizzled. She was grateful for the footman's thoroughness. She hadn't even thought of that eventuality. She gave her head a quick shake to regain her senses and concentrated on Stanley's continued explanation, nodding to show she was listening. If anyone grabs you from the side or the back, you have a few options. You could try to drop down low, slipping out of his grasp. That could work, but then again, your skirts could be a problem. Depending on the attacker's position, you could also use your knees to good effect. But if he is directly behind you, that probably wouldn't work. The best bet for an attack from behind is to use your head. My head? She parroted, all her attention focused on the young man's words. Yes, throw your head backwards to crush him in the nose. But this could bite you back if you miss his nose and hit his head, as it will hurt you as much as him. And you could be stunned from the blow. Elizabeth was nodding, feeling nerves tighten all over her body. How have I come to this point, where I am contemplating ways of fending off possible attacks from my future husband, or one of his henchmen? She shook herself from her inertia and focused again on the footman's instructions. The final thing I have to say to you, m'lady, is if you find yourself under attack, forget that you are a lady. Use every means at your disposal to escape and keep yourself safe. You are an Earl's daughter and soon to be an Earl's wife. No scandal will be allowed to touch you for looking after yourself under an attack. It is more important to get yourself free. Elizabeth nodded and smiled over the young man's wise words. They went through a few more practice runs, and then Elizabeth dismissed the footman with a reminder to keep this to himself, and a request to return the following day for another practice session. By then, it was time to get ready for the evening's events. After her bath, Elizabeth was seated at her dressing table, deep in thought. What is troubling you now, my lady? Are you too worn out from the exertions? Ought we to send your regrets for the evening? I wish I could, Pansy, but after last night I am quite certain my mother will consider it imperative that I show my face around town. The entire point of this engagement is to avert scandal. If I hide myself away, it will be assumed that I have something for which to be ashamed, and the talk will increase, not disappear as we intend. Then why the long face? The maid persisted. Elizabeth sighed. While I truly appreciate Stanley's instructions, and I will keep them in mind and practice them again on the morrow, I fear that they will not be sufficient. When you think on it, there are so very many ways for a man to rid himself of an unwanted wife. A so-called shooting accident, poison, a good shove down the stairs or out a window, Even a riding accident could be arranged. No, I do not think that these self-defense instructions will be sufficient. We need to find out how the previous Countess died. While he would most likely have to change his method, lest suspicion be truly focused on him, because really 2 suspicious deaths would be difficult to escape. If we could find out the means of her death, it could give us some idea of his methods, and I would be better prepared. Pansy gazed at her mistress with a mixture of awe and consternation. Did you ever think that maybe he didn't do it? Elizabeth's smile was faint. It did cross my mind. But I don't think a rumour like that springs from thin air. There must be a reason he is suspected of killing her. I need to find out whatever I can, and the most damning piece of evidence against him is the fact that the poor woman is dead. The maid could not argue with her mistress's logic, and went back to combing out her long, silvery hair. She concentrated on twisting it this way and that to the best advantage, arranging it into an intricate design. Sighing with pleasure, Elizabeth surveyed the results in the mirror. Pansy, you are an artist with hair. I marvel every time you do it. I do believe I am the luckiest girl in London with how wonderful my maid is. Get on with you, my lady. The maid flushed in delight over her mistress's compliment. Now, we had best get a move on, or your mother will be having my head in a noose if you are held up much longer. I am quite certain the blame will be laid quite accurately at my feet, Pansy. Have no fear. But you are probably right. She will definitely be ready to ring a peal over me if I am not below stairs momentarily. What have you selected for me this evening? The maid held up a shimmering gown of a deceptively simple design. The light pink silk was threaded through with a darker pink that matched the ribbons tied in Elizabeth's hair. The lady could see that it had been a wise choice, as the colour would reflect somewhat on her face, belying the pallor that her worries were causing. Excellent as always, Pansy, Elizabeth commented as the gown was gently settled around her. No one shall know the turmoil I am in from looking at me. It is perfect. She turned from her reflection and grimaced at her maid. Wish me luck. You shan't need it, my lady, the maid vowed loyally as she waved her mistress from the room. Elizabeth took a deep breath and entered the morning-room, where she knew her mother would be waiting for her. What she hadn't expected was for Lord Sinclair to be there as well. He stood abruptly upon her entrance. Her breath caught at the back of her throat as she took in his remarkable male beauty. His neatly arranged hair once again made her fingers twitch to feel if it was nearly as soft as it looked. His dark, formal attire for the evening reflected his attention to detail, and the way he filled out the form-fitting jacket conveyed just how fit the Earl was. His face looked severe as his skin pulled tightly over his high cheekbones, but once her gaze finally reached his eyes, she could see that he was regarding her warmly, and her stomach turned over as a wave of awareness and attraction washed over her. She willed herself not to give herself away with a shiver as she dipped into a respectful curtsy and glanced at the other occupants of the room. Elizabeth was surprised to see that her father was present. She was glad to see him. It would seem he was also going to lend his presence to reinforce her respectability. If only everyone had thought to defend me without the necessity of marrying a stranger, she thought, as she fought to quell her resentment. She pasted a sweet smile to her lips as her mother took control over the conversation and directed them all from the room and into the carriage. Elizabeth hadn't even needed to say a word. Elizabeth's mother had informed her that they would be stopping into 3 different events that evening, all the better to show themselves to the most people. The ridiculousness of the ways of the Tons struck her once more. At least with her marriage, she would be able to retire from society if she wished. She realized she ought to ask her future husband for his thoughts on the matter. She could feel all eyes upon them as soon as they arrived at their first destination. Elizabeth could hardly take notice of their surroundings as she struggled to quell her nerves. She was glad that Justice pulled her into his arms as soon as they reached the dance floor. As the music began, she was happy to recognize the distinctive rhythm of the waltz. "It would seem this is the only dance we know," she remarked to the Earl with a teasing note in her voice. He quirked his eyebrow at her, but did not comment, merely twirling her expertly through the crowd of dancing couples. "I have come up with a few questions I didn't think to ask you this afternoon," she began. As she felt his grip tighten on her hand reflexively, she almost quailed before he relaxed once more. She would have thought him unaffected by her statement, if not for that slight reaction. Elizabeth wondered if she was putting too much meaning into the small gesture, and regretted the man's iron control over his features. She sighed and waited for him to speak. "Well, are you going to ask them?" he prompted when she did not continue. She smiled slightly. "Here and now?" she asked. "Is that not why you brought it up?" he countered, searching her face. She shrugged. "I will admit I didn't think it through thoroughly. One of my questions I just thought of on the drive here. I think I am nearing the end of my tolerance for the silliness of society, and I'm thinking that will be one advantage to our marriage. This season shall not be a necessity once I am off the marriage mart." She was bemused to see the satisfied smile that crossed his face before he schooled his features once more into a look of patient tolerance for her questions. "Was there a question in there somewhere, my dear lady?" he asked, laughing at her. Elizabeth huffed, but wasn't really put out by his teasing. Having older brothers, it was actually endearingly familiar to hear the man's teasing. "I was wondering how much of the season you will wish to partake of in the future, and as your wife, what will you expect of me in connection with the season?" "Well, I would like to take my seat in the house, at least for parts of each session, and I would prefer to have my family with me." Elizabeth felt heat colour her cheeks at his veiled reference to future children, but waited for him to continue. "But even if you are in London, you needn't attend any of the Ton events if you do not wish. Of course, after a time, you may find that you wish to attend certain select things, just to catch up with old friends or to stave off boredom if I am overly pressed with government business. And, of course, if we are blessed with daughters, we will have to keep up certain connections, so that we shall be able to launch them successfully into society. I shall leave that up to you, my dear. Now that I no longer have to search for a bride, I shan't find it necessary to attend a single event unless you wish for my escort." If she did not doubt his sincerity, Elizabeth would have been delighted by his answer. He painted a picture of a wonderful future. She only prayed she could live to see it. She hoped her smile did not look as grim as it felt all of a sudden. Justice once again was left wondering what was going through his future bride's mind. She had a wonderfully expressive face, but the emotions that crossed it were not always identifiable. He would have sworn she was happy with his reply to a question, but now she appeared worried once more. "What troubles you now, my lady?" he prompted her. "All is well, my lord, thank you." She lied to his face, much to his surprise. He had previously exulted in her honesty. Now he wondered if it had been the figment of his imagination. Glancing over her head, Justice could feel many curious eyes watching their progress around the dance floor. He had the prickly sensation of being scrutinized. He knew the two of them were the center of attention due to their sudden betrothal and the events that precipitated it. But this felt like more than that. His protective instincts toward the woman in his arms took over, and he had to fight the urge to pull her closer than propriety would tolerate. His grip on her tightened, and he could feel her stiffen in his arms. "What is it?" she asked, revealing her awareness of his sudden tension. Justice glanced down into a searching gaze and decided to make a hypocrite of himself. He may not like her to be dishonest with him, but he was not above doing the same to her. "Nothing at all, my dear lady. I am just enjoying the sensation of having you in my arms." He enjoyed the deep blush that flooded her face at his words, and had to fight not to laugh with delight. Justice was quite well aware that she was an innocent, and he had no wish to discomfort her, particularly not under the watchful eyes of the Ton's gossips, who were avidly waiting for any misstep they might make. He was just glad that his words made her sufficiently uncomfortable that she would not question him further. In an effort to turn her attention, he prompted, "You mentioned you had a few questions for me. Have I sufficiently answered your first one, and do you care to ask me any more?" When he felt her searching gaze upon his face, Justice realized she had not been fully distracted by his reply, but she did not pursue the subject. Instead, she accepted his change of subject and asked him for further information. "I am sorry to admit to you that I am not quite up to date on the subject of your family. Do you have any relatives living at Heath? I am assuming, since you have your title, that your father is no longer alive. But is there a Dowager Countess of Heath? And what about your neighbours? Shall I know anyone within the vicinity of your home?" Justice noticed she was not yet ready to take ownership of his property, not referring to it as their home. But he reminded himself that it would take time. They weren't even married yet. He would have to exercise patience. Sadly, I am an orphan, with only distant relations to fend off the loneliness. That is one of the things I find so appealing about a union with you. Since you come from such a large family, our children will not be alone in the world like I was. He hadn't meant to play upon her sympathies, but was delighted to see a softening in her expression at his words. He really wished he could read her mind and know what was going on inside her head. But he contented himself with the fact that she no longer appeared to be searching for ways to reject him. When it became obvious that she had nothing to add to his words, he continued to answer her questions. So, in answer to your question, no, there are no relatives lurking about on my estate. It shall be yours to do with as you choose. As the new lady of the manor, you will have all the authority you might wish. I just ask that you keep your fingers out of my library. Whatever do you mean? Shall I not be permitted to enter? She appeared to be surprised, but not overly aghast. Justice laughed. Of course you may enter, my dear lady. The house shall be yours, as I said. I just do not wish you to redecorate my own personal space without my permission. It would appear he had offered her an entirely new concept to mull over. Do you mean by that, my lord, that I shall be permitted to redecorate wherever else I might choose? Her delighted grin made him glad that he had thought to say it. Why, yes, my dear. I had assumed it was what every lady wished to do upon her marriage. Elizabeth shrugged. I do not think my mother was permitted to touch a single room for at least the first 10 years of her marriage. So no, my lord, the thought had not even crossed my mind to imagine redecorating your home. But I do appreciate the carte blanche you have offered me. I will keep it in mind when we arrive upon your estate. She paused for a moment, mulling over their conversation. He saw her eyes widen and braced himself for her next question. How recently have your rooms been redone? He struggled not to chuckle over her choice of words. She wished to know how extensively his first wife had redecorated. Justice had absolutely no desire to discuss his first wife with his future one, but it was a valid question, and he tried to answer it fairly. The previous Countess had not turned her attention to the decor much before her death, so only her own rooms were started. I am sorry to tell you that the work was never completed, so you shall have to share my rooms. Feeling her stiffen in his arms even further, he realized he ought to offer her an alternative. Or you can take advantage of another room nearby while you oversee the work to your satisfaction. Well, at least there's a silver lining, my lord. If the work needs to be completed, at least I shall be able to make my own choices, and it shall give me an idea of how much work goes into remodeling. If I find it is to my taste, I shall be fully informed as to what's involved. She paused for a moment, and Justice wondered if she was going to say anything more. He was rewarded for his patience as she finally met his eyes with a small smile. Thank you for your generous offer of allowing me to make myself feel at home in your house. Justice allowed his grip to tighten once more upon her. I would really like it if you could think of it as our home, together. Elizabeth felt another one of those delicious chills shiver up and down her back. She wished she were not so very aware of him and his low, deep voice. She found his presence so confusing. The way he spoke, she got the impression he really was planning to keep her around for a shared future. Perhaps he had what he would consider a good reason for killing his first wife, she thought a little hysterically. Not that she could ever condone it, but perhaps it didn't necessarily mean he had any intention of killing her. Just because she was about to be the next Countess of Heath did not necessarily have to mean that she was on her way to an early grave. All she had to do was find out why he killed the Countess, and then avoid causing him any reason to want to be rid of her, Lady Elizabeth. Perhaps she could talk to Lady Merriweather. She had sounded so convinced of his guilt. She must know something. Elizabeth thought for a moment before shuddering at the thought of how quickly it would be bandied about amongst the ton if she were to do so. She took herself to task. How could she possibly be rationalizing the prospect of living with a murderer? I must have truly lost my mind the night I met him, she thought rather crossly as she tore her eyes away from his deep gaze, refusing to allow him to see into her soul. She concentrated on the steps of the dance, and tried to still her racing heart. "How can I be so attracted to the man, while at the same time be wondering if he intends to kill me?" she wondered. "I never did tell you anything about our neighbours," the Earl reminded her quietly in her ear, as the melody wound to a conclusion and he escorted her from the dance floor. Elizabeth was quite certain he knew exactly what he was doing to her whenever he whispered in her ear like that. It was enough to drive her mad. She wanted to stamp her foot like a child and throw herself into his arms simultaneously. Neither option bore consideration. She kept her smile bland as she looked up at him from beneath her eyelashes. She shrugged. "At least it gives us something to talk about when next you call." His rich, low laughter above her ear rewarded her quick wit. She was glad he found her amusing. Perhaps he would keep her around just for entertainment. Elizabeth shook her head at her musings. She was becoming rather ghoulish. The Viscount of Brackendale stood on the side of the dance floor, his relaxed demeanour belying the eagerness in his eyes, as he waited to claim her hand for the next dance. Elizabeth was inordinately pleased to see him. "My lord, what a relief to see you! Please, you must tell me everything you know about Rosamond." With those words Elizabeth was whisked from his side, and Justice was left staring after her, surprised to be swept by a wave of jealousy, as he wondered how much of a scandal it would cause if he cut in while his fiancée was dancing with another man. "Do not try to make a cake of yourself, my dear." Justice turned to find the Countess of Yorkley at his side, laughing up at him. "I beg your pardon, my lady." He made an effort to feign ignorance. "Feeling jealous is perfectly normal and even acceptable. Embarrassing the poor young woman, even more than you already have, would not be. You have nothing to fear in that quarter, I am quite sure. It is merely a dance after all." Justice felt like growling at the woman at his side, but managed to remain civilized. "That is not how it looks from this angle." "Then change your perspective, my lord." Her reply was beginning to sound caustic. "Go get yourself a glass of the tepid punch, or go to the card-room and see if any of your old cronies are present. I care not what you do, but do not even dare to cause that young woman a moment of discomfort this evening. If you have any hope of having a happy future, how you act in the next few days will have a great bearing on it. Tread carefully." The Earl turned to regard the other woman with wary respect. "How have you become so wise, my lady?" "I am a keen observer of people, and her dearest friend is a dear friend of mine, so, in her stead, I feel as though I must stand up for the darling Lady Elizabeth. In addition, our hostess this evening is my sister-in-law, and while she would probably love for there to be some sort of scandalous behaviour taking place at her ball, I aim to see her thwarted." Now Justice really was amused by Lady Yorkley's attitude. "You are a genuine friend, my lady. Thank you for stepping in to save me from myself." With those words he bowed to her and took her advice, going in search of a drink. He thought to return to the ballroom with a glass for Elizabeth, but came across Lord Austen and was sidetracked, remembering what Elizabeth had told him about his plot with Sir Broderick. "Good evening, my lord," he began. "Are you here this evening dancing attendance upon your daughter?" He was relieved that he was safely publicly betrothed, as he did not want the weak-willed nobleman aligned with his household. He could see the man's eagerness to see him giving way to resignation, as he remembered that the Earl had just declared himself for Lady Elizabeth. It would have been amusing if it were not so very disturbing. "My daughter is happily engaged in the dancing, my lord, but I shall tell her that you asked after her." Lord Austen's reply was almost smug, making the Earl grit his teeth over the desire to give the man a well-deserved set-down. As Lady Yorkley had reminded him, anything he did over the next few days, and really now for the rest of his life, would reflect on Lady Elizabeth, but under the circumstances he really needed to protect her from anything the gossips might wish to throw at her. "Especially until I have her safely ensconced on my estate," he thought, with a hint of satisfaction at the thought of having her all to himself in his home. He felt a deep sense of contentment and optimism he hadn't felt in several years. With a jaunty grin, Justice tried not to look like a simpleton as he took his leave of Lord Austen and resumed his search for refreshments for himself and his lady.